Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty fundamental, right? I mean, the critical
Yeah.
philosophy of race. We're working with some really rich ideas here coming straight from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And our mission today is to kind of go beyond those, simple definitions of race and really dig into how philosophers think about this concept, what it means for society, how we see the world.
Yeah, this isn't just, calling out racism when we see it. This is like a full-on philosophical investigation of the idea of race itself. It's about its impact. Like what are the consequences of having this idea of race in the first place?
And what's so cool about this field is it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Critical philosophy of race, it pulls in all these different threads,
Yeah.
right? I mean, from critical legal studies, critical race theory, all the way to like Marxism,
Oh,
phenomenology,
right. And post-structuralism, even psychoanalysis. I mean, the range is huge.
and even then, it's not afraid to like turn that critical lens inward, right? Even these influential theories, they get examined for their own blind spots when it comes to racial domination.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly checking our own tools, making sure they're up to the task.
So today we're going to be tackling some pretty big questions. We want to figure out, how did the idea of race even come about? Like, how is it shaped by, you know, social and historical forces? And then how does racism work? Not just on an individual level, but like woven into the fabric of our systems and structures.
Yeah, and how does race shape who we think we are?
Right.
Like our identity, our sense of self.
Right. And what about the link between race and things like class or gender? And where does all this leave like the giants of philosophy, the ones we all read in school? Like, how do we approach them now, given all that we're learning about race?
Right. Like, how do we reevaluate that whole tradition? I think to start unpacking all this, we got to go back to the beginning. Like, where did this concept of race even come from?
Yeah, let's trace it back.
So we got to look at like the 17th to 19th centuries in Europe. That's when you see modern philosophers really getting into this idea of race.
And they weren't just describing groups, right? They were using race to create hierarchies, to rank people.
Exactly.
You have these big names like Kant, Rousseau, Mill, they're all wrestling with race. But they're coming to some pretty different conclusions, like, are racial differences fixed? Are they, fluid? Can they change?
Right. And it's interesting because those hard science biological definitions of race, like they came later.
Yeah,
And even those are still debated today. So even at its root, the idea of race has this philosophical dimension to it.
totally. And seeing those philosophical roots helps us understand how race got tied up with things like colonialism. It helped justify these inequalities that were already in place.
Yeah. And it's still shaping our thinking today in ways we might not even realize. So building on that historical understanding, let's get into critical legal studies, right?
Yeah.
CLS, and then critical race theory, because these had a huge impact on the critical philosophy of race.
Okay, so CLS emerges in the 70s, and one of its big contributions is this idea that the law, right, which we think of as being neutral and objective, is actually upholding existing social hierarchies. Like, it's not an impartial referee after all.
Yeah, they were like, wait a minute, the law isn't actually colorblind. It's got its own biases.
And they had evidence, right? They pointed to all these patterns and legal outcomes that consistently disadvantaged certain groups. And even this core legal principle, stare decisis.
Right, the idea that judges should follow precedent.
Yeah. CLS scholars said that that could actually perpetuate injustice if the precedents themselves were discriminatory. So they really pushed us to look deeper.
Yeah, and they challenged this idea that legal responsibility comes down to just proving intent. Like, did someone consciously set out to discriminate? They said, look, there are these underlying assumptions, these structures in place that can create inequality even if nobody's explicitly trying to be racist.
So things like the way we think about male power, or the idea that treating everyone the same is automatically fair, even if they're not starting from the same place.
Exactly. And that's where critical race theory comes in, right? Or CRT.
Mhm.
It takes those insights from CLS and focuses specifically on how race operates within the legal system, but also like in the broader social context.
So it's saying that racial power isn't just about overt acts of discrimination.
Right. It's baked into all these seemingly neutral practices, policies, even just like the values we hold as a society.
So even if something seems fair on paper, it could still be having a racially discriminatory effect.
Exactly. And CRT scholars also push back against this idea that any focus on race is inherently racist. That we should strive for this colorblind ideal.
Right, like that's the answer. Just ignore race and it'll go away.
Exactly. They argue that this perspective, it actually makes things worse. It prevents us from seeing the ongoing impact of historical racism,
Hmm.
and therefore we can't address it.
It's like trying to solve a problem you refuse to acknowledge exists.
Right. And Richard Delgado, he did this research that really highlights this point. He found that in 1984, most of the cited civil rights scholarship was written by white men.
Wow.
And that raises serious questions about whose voices are being heard when we talk about racial justice, like who's shaping our understanding of these issues.
It makes you think about how knowledge is created,
Yeah.
right? Whose perspectives get prioritized and whose get marginalized.
Exactly. And he even talks about this incident where a scholar dismissed really valuable firsthand accounts from people of color because they weren't, elegant enough. He preferred a more polished source from a white author, even though it was less relevant to the discussion.
That's wild. So even in academia, there's this bias towards certain ways of knowing, certain voices. And that brings us to another question, like, how does critical philosophy of race actually do philosophy? What methods does it use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while some scholars in this field use methods from analytic philosophy, a really defining characteristic of CPR is its engagement with continental philosophy. Thinkers like Foucault, Sartre, Fanon, Derrida, they've been super influential, especially their focus on power, on subjectivity, on how reality is socially constructed.
So CPR is drawing on these big names, but it's not just blindly accepting everything they say, right?
Hmm.
The source points out that CPR scholars also critique these thinkers for their own blind spots when it comes to race.
Oh, for sure. I mean, nobody's perfect. But the
Yeah.
point is, the continental tradition gives us some really valuable tools for thinking about these invisible structures that shape our social and political lives, and especially how those structures affect people of color differently.
And it sounds like there's a real effort to broaden the scope of philosophy, right? To bring in voices that have been historically excluded from that traditional European canon.
Absolutely. We're talking about thinkers like Fanon, Glissant, Dubois said their work is central to this field.
And there's this really interesting thing happening where some CPR scholars are doing what they call creolizing canonical figures. So they're taking someone like Rousseau, for example,
Yeah.
and they're looking at how he was received and interpreted in the colonized world. So they're reading him through the lens of Fanon or CLR James, for instance.
Right. It's like bringing in these different perspectives, creating this dialogue between thinkers who might not have ever even met, but whose ideas actually speak to each other in really profound ways.
It's about expanding the conversation, right?
Well,
Making sure more voices are heard when we're dealing with these fundamental ideas about who we are and how we understand the world. Now, CPR isn't just one monolithic thing, right? It uses a bunch of different approaches, like discourse analysis, psychoanalysis, even phenomenology.
right. And what unites these different approaches is this shared commitment to understanding how race actually operates in our societies, how it affects our social structures, but also our individual experiences. And unlike some parts of analytic philosophy of race, CPR isn't so focused on debating the scientific validity of race, like should we even be using these racial categories? Instead, it's about understanding the social and political weight that race carries as it exists in the world right now.
Okay, so it's less about definitions and more about the impact, the consequences.
Exactly. And it's about understanding how resistance to racial injustice can sometimes be co-opted, like absorbed back into the system in ways that ultimately maintain the status quo.
Right. So it's not just that these categories exist, but it's how they're used, how they shift and change over time, and who benefits from that.
Exactly. Race isn't this static thing. It's constantly being shaped by history, by power dynamics. And one of the big questions is how certain groups have been marked as inherently problematic, like they're seen as a threat simply because of their race. So the focus isn't just on dividing people into groups, but on understanding how those groups have been historically constructed and how that construction has real consequences.
So the shift from definition to like the operation of power, that's really central to CPR.
Totally.
Okay, let's dive into phenomenology, this approach that's all about lived experience. It seems like it's been super valuable for understanding how race impacts our lives, our interactions with the world, even our own sense of self.
Totally. I mean, early phenomenologists, they didn't really talk about race that much, but the questions they were asking about anguish, freedom, time, social reality, those turned out to be super relevant for understanding the experience of race.
The source mentions this concept from Husserl, the natural attitude. It's like this background of assumptions that shapes how we see and experience the world, but it's often unexamined.
Right. It's just there.
And CPR is looking at how social structures actually create and reinforce those natural attitudes, especially when it comes to group identity.
Right. So we're not just born with these assumptions. They're shaped by our social environment, by the groups we belong to, the experiences we have.
So when we're talking about race, phenomenology can help us unpack how our individual experiences are shaped by a society that's already marked by racial inequality. Like maybe you feel uncomfortable in a certain situation and you're not even sure why, but it could be rooted in these deep-seated racist ideas that have become part of your natural attitude.
Yeah, it can be that subtle.
Yeah.
And then you have thinkers like Sartre, Beauvoir, Fanon, right? They start to really explore how our racial identity shapes the most fundamental aspects of our being.
Like how we perceive things, how we experience our own bodies, how we relate to other people. It's like race becomes this lens through which we experience everything.
Yeah, and Fanon's work on Black embodiment is crucial here. He talks about how, in an anti-Black society, a Black person's actions, their very being, is constantly interpreted through this lens of racist stereotypes.
It's like every move they make is filtered through these pre-existing judgments.
Exactly. And that severely restricts their agency, their
Yeah.
ability to just be themselves, to move through the world freely. It's almost like having to constantly anticipate those racist reactions, which can be incredibly exhausting.
It must be so restrictive to always be aware of how you're being perceived, judged, misinterpreted, and to always be on guard against potential hostility.
Yeah, it takes a huge toll.
Yeah.
And building on Fanon's work, you have scholars like Lewis Gordon. He developed these new existential categories to really capture the complexity of Black existence in anti-Black worlds. He talks about this double bind of invisibility and hypervisibility.
That's a really interesting idea. So invisible in some ways, but overly visible in others.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Black pain can be systematically ignored, but then Black bodies are simultaneously subjected to intense scrutiny in spaces that are perceived as white.
So unseen when it comes to their suffering, but hyper visible when they're in spaces where they're not supposed to be.
Yeah. And he also talks about the invisibility of Black subjectivity.
Yeah.
Like, Black people are treated as projections of white needs and anxieties, rather than as individuals with their own inner lives, their own desires, their own ways of seeing the world.
Like they're not seen as fully human with their own complex thoughts and feelings.
Right. And Gordon uses this analogy of pets. He says their affection is valued because they don't judge their owners. So in a way, it's similar for Black individuals. As long as they stay within those narrow expectations, they're acceptable. But the moment they assert their own subjectivity, they challenge those projections, that's when they face backlash.
It's like they're only acceptable as long as they conform to these very limited roles that white society has created for them.
Exactly. And that leads to another really important point that comes out of phenomenology. The idea that racism isn't a single monolithic thing. There are multiple racisms, each with its own history, its own context, its own way of manifesting in people's lives.
So moving beyond this idea that any awareness of race is bad.
Right. It's about looking at the specific ways that different racial groups experience racism and the different forms that racism takes. So, for example, phenomenologists are analyzing how white racial consciousness works.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, thinkers like Shannon Sullivan talk about things like unconscious self-attributions of innocence, this willful ignorance about the realities of race, and this sense of entitlement, this ontological expansiveness, where white people feel like they inherently belong in certain spaces, and they have the right to control those spaces.
So it's not just about individual prejudice. It's about these broader patterns of thought and behavior that are often invisible to the people who benefit from them. And while there might be some common threads between different forms of racism, like hostility towards certain groups, or this belief in inherent racial differences,
Right.
the specific ways that those things play out can be very different depending on the context.
Absolutely. And Gordon's very term, anti-Black racism, underscores the unique history and the ongoing impact of racism that's rooted in slavery and colonialism. It's different from other forms of racism in some crucial ways.
So understanding the specific historical and social context is really important.
Yeah. And scholars like Emily Lee and David Haekwon Kim have used phenomenology to illuminate the specific dynamics of anti-Asian racism. For example, the harm caused by the model minority myth.
That expectation that Asian people will be quiet, hardworking, successful in very specific ways. And if they don't fit that mold, it's seen as a problem.
Exactly. And Kim argues that these aren't just abstract beliefs. They operate as these deeply felt emotional states that shape desires, expectations, understandings. For example, the way that Asian passivity might be perceived as a positive thing within a certain white supremacist framework.
It's almost like a way of controlling people, even if it's not always intentional. And the source connects this to Heidegger's idea of Dasein, this fundamental sense of being in the world. It's about feeling at home, feeling like you belong. And it points out how phenomenology has helped us understand the experiences of immigrants, of transnational people, whose sense of belonging can be disrupted by migration and racism.
Right. Mariana Ortega's work on the phenomenology of migrant life is really insightful here. It's about that feeling of never quite being fully at home anywhere.
And it seems like those experiences of displacement can actually lead to a more critical awareness of the world, right? Like they have to question all these assumptions that dominant groups often take for granted.
Exactly. And this leads to some important revisions within phenomenology itself. CPR scholars have criticized early phenomenologists for universalizing human experience based on a white Western perspective.
Right, like assuming that everyone has the same starting point.
Exactly. They also point out that non-dominant groups rarely have the privilege of this unquestioned existence, you know?
Mhm.
Like they don't get to just be. They have to constantly think about their identity and how they're perceived by others.
Because like white people and men, they haven't historically had to think about being white or being male in the same way that marginalized groups have. It's just the default.
Right. And going back to Sartre, his concept of bad faith, this
Mm.
idea that we deceive ourselves about our freedom and responsibility to avoid anxiety,
Right.
that's been applied to understanding racism too. It's this deep-seated need to maintain a sense of moral goodness, even when it means ignoring or denying the reality of injustice.
So bad faith is this way of protecting our own egos, even if it means perpetuating harm.
Exactly.
Mm.
And it's powerful because it challenges this idea that we can just easily examine our biases and overcome them. Racism can be so deeply ingrained that we don't even recognize it's there.
It's like a defense mechanism. And phenomenology also helps us see how race and racism distort our experience of time. Thinkers like Glissant and Paz, they talk about the multiple temporalities that exist in colonized spaces. Like, there's this dominant narrative of progress, but then there's the lived experience of being stuck in a marginalized periphery.
Right, like being trapped in a different time zone almost. And Aliyah Al-Saji, she talks about how dominant groups can perceive marginalized groups as existing at a different time, as being behind somehow. And that justifies treating them differently, rather than engaging with them as equals.
It's like denying them their full humanity, their full participation in the present moment. And that connects to contemporary decolonial philosophy, which draws on these phenomenological insights to uncover all these hidden assumptions that we might still be blind to.
Exactly. But there's also this hopeful aspect to it, this understanding that as human beings, we're always in process, we're always becoming. And that potential for self-creation, for change, that can be really powerful in the fight against racism.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how racial identities are constructed. A central argument here, building on the work of Elaine Locke, is that race isn't this biological reality, it's a social and cultural creation.
Right. That's a fundamental idea in critical philosophy of race. Locke said, yeah, there might be some physical traits associated with different groups, but race itself is a social and ethnic thing. It's shaped by history, by power dynamics, by culture. He also pointed out this interesting tension within racial consciousness. Like, it can be a tool for recognizing reality, for fighting for justice,
Right.
but it can also lead to prejudice and division if it's not carefully examined.
So it's a double-edged sword, in a way. And then there's the question of how these socially constructed categories of race relate to our own sense of self. Charles Mills makes this really powerful point about how being assigned a racial identity shapes your entire life trajectory.
Yeah, your upbringing, your experiences, your worldview, everything.
And he says that any philosophy of the self that ignores these social and historical factors like race is probably assuming a white Western perspective.
Right, because that's historically been the dominant perspective.
So how do we understand this relationship between these big social categories of race and our individual sense of self? Is it a one-way street? Does society just impose these identities on us?
No, it's definitely more dynamic than that. It's a back and forth.
Mhm.
The meanings of race, they've been shaped by the people who have been most affected by racism, through their resistance, their struggles for survival and recognition.
So it's a dialogue between these big social forces and individual agency. People are pushing back against these imposed categories, redefining them, finding new meanings within them.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that race, as we understand it today, it's historically and culturally specific. It really took shape in Europe during the age of colonialism. this idea of fixed racial hierarchies. That was used to justify all kinds of things, from voting rights to immigration laws.
So it wasn't just an abstract concept, it had real-world consequences, and it still does.
Yeah. And that historical legacy can make it seem like race is something that's imposed on us from the outside. Like these categories are created by the powerful to divide and control people. And while that's definitely part of it, it's important to remember that individuals and communities can also actively shape the meanings of their own racial identities. It's not just a passive process.
So it's not just about these categories being imposed, but also about how people respond to them, how they reclaim them, how they use them to create new forms of solidarity and resistance.
Right. And from this understanding of race as socially constructed, you often get two related ideas. One is that philosophical discussions about, the self and morality, they can be separate from social identities like race. And the other is that the goal is to eventually get rid of the concept of race altogether, to eliminate it as a relevant category.
Like in France, where they don't collect racial statistics, the idea is that if we just stop talking about race, it'll go away.
Right. But critical philosophy of race, it offers a different perspective. It
Yeah.
says that trying to eliminate race prematurely, it could actually make things worse. It erases history, it silences the experiences of people who have been marginalized because of their race.
It's like saying those experiences don't matter, that history doesn't matter.
Exactly. And this goes back to the philosopher Gadamer, who talked about the importance of historical consciousness. We need to understand the past in order to make sense of the present. And Sartre, too, he saw the self as constantly being shaped by our social circumstances and our choices. So for people who have been oppressed because of their racial identity is part of their story. It's part of who they are. To try to erase that is to deny their lived experience.
So while CPR acknowledges that race is socially constructed, it also emphasizes the impact that those categories have on our lives, our sense of self, our understanding of the world. It's not something that can be easily dismissed or ignored.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into the historical construction of race. The source points out that it's not just about these top-down policies and legal frameworks. It's also about the collective agency of people who have been racialized. Social movements, both those fighting for equality and those trying to uphold the existing hierarchies, they play a huge role in shaping the meaning of race.
So it's not just about what the powerful do, it's also about how people respond, how they organize, how they resist.
Exactly. And Du Bois offers a really interesting perspective on this. He uses a Hegelian approach to understand how African people in the diaspora created their own sense of self, their own culture, even in the face of slavery.
So even under these incredibly oppressive conditions, there's this creative act of self-definition happening.
Right. It's about resilience. It's about finding ways to maintain your humanity even when the world is trying to deny it.
And in Latin America, you have thinkers like Jose Vasconcelos and Jose Carlos Mariátegui who are articulating their own visions of racial identity that have huge political implications.
Right. So Vasconcelos, with his idea of the cosmic race and his concept of mestizaje, the mixing of races, he saw this as a positive force, something that could unify humanity. But it's important to note that his vision still had its own racial hierarchies, with mixed-race people often seen as superior to those considered pure, black, or indigenous.
So even when you're talking about racial mixing, there can still be these underlying ideas about which groups are better than others.
Exactly. And Mariátegui offered a different perspective. He criticized the idea of assimilation, arguing that indigenous communities should be recognized and respected for their distinct cultures and their historical claims to their land.
So there's this tension between assimilation and the recognition of difference. And in the post-independence era in many Latin American countries, racial identity took on these new meanings. Terms like Black and Indian, which were originally imposed by colonizers, became symbols of shared history, shared struggle.
Yeah, it's like reclaiming those labels and giving them new power, a new sense of pride.
And that connects to the cultural construction of race, right? The source reminds us that while civilizations and peoples aren't the same as races, there's definitely a link between racialized histories and culture.
Yeah, Locke talks about this, how socially created races can be characterized by shared cultural elements. But again, it's important to understand that those cultural elements are products of history and experience, not inherent biological traits. We can't reduce culture to race, but we also can't ignore the impact of shared racial histories on the development of culture.
It's a complex relationship. And the concept of negritude, which came out of the anti-colonial movements in Africa and the Caribbean, that's a great example of this intersection of race and culture. It was essentially an attempt to articulate a distinct Black culture.
Yeah, and there were different interpretations of what that meant. Some, like Singhor, leaned towards more biological understandings of Black culture. But others, like Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, they saw it as a product of métissage, this cultural and intellectual mixing that happened in the context of colonialism. They envisioned a new society that drew on both modern ideas and traditional African values, explicitly rejecting the barbarity of colonialism and celebrating Black culture in all its forms.
So it wasn't just about political liberation, it was about cultural liberation too.
Exactly. It was about reclaiming agency, about defining yourself on your own terms. And Aimé Césaire talked about this process of disalienation, overcoming the psychological and cultural damage caused by colonialism by being forced to assimilate into the colonizer's culture.
So it's about breaking free from those imposed identities and reclaiming your own sense of self.
Right. But negritude also had its critics. Some pointed out that it could lead to oversimplification, to a kind of cultural homogenization. And there were debates about what role things like emotion and intuition should play in defining Black identity.
And even within negritude, there were different perspectives. Sartre, for example, he saw it as a necessary but temporary stage. Like eventually we'd move beyond these racial categories and achieve some kind of universal humanism.
Right. But Fanon rejected that. He famously said, "It is the white man who creates the Negro, but it is the Negro who creates negritude." So for him, it wasn't about transcending race. It was about actively creating and shaping your own identity in the face of oppression.
So it's not about erasing difference, it's about affirming it, about reclaiming it. And Glissant, he added another layer to this. He critiqued the idea of a single, unified history, arguing that we need to understand the multiple and intercepting histories that have been shaped by colonialism. It's about recognizing the complexity of the past and how that complexity continues to shape our present.
Exactly. And Fanon and Cabral, they also had concerns about negritude potentially downplaying the internal diversity of the Black experience.
Right. It's about recognizing that Blackness isn't a monolithic thing. There's a huge range of experiences and perspectives within that category.
Totally. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about whiteness. Because the construction of racial identity, that's not just something that happens to marginalized groups. It shapes what it means to be white, too. And the meanings and experiences of whiteness, they can vary a lot depending on the context. But often there's this underlying sense of being the norm, of being superior.
And Dubois, in his essay, The Souls of White Folks, he really gets into the psychological effects of this belief in white superiority. Even when it's not consciously acknowledged, it can lead to all these distorted perceptions and behaviors. He talks about these conditioned reflexes and long-followed habits that become almost invisible to the people who benefit from them.
Right. It's like this unconscious sense of entitlement that shapes how white people see the world and their place in it.
And Dubois argues that this belief in superiority, even when it's not based in reality, can breed resentment and create all these illusions about the self and others.
Yeah, it can lead to this defensiveness, this inability to see things clearly.
And Dubois even claims that as a Black scholar, he has this unique perspective, this epistemic advantage, because he's not blinded by those illusions of whiteness.
Right. He's able to see the system more clearly because he's both inside and outside of it. And Charles Mills builds on this with his concept of the epistemology of ignorance. It's about the ways that dominant groups actively avoid or suppress knowledge that might challenge their sense of moral superiority.
So it's not just about not knowing, it's about actively choosing not to know.
Yeah.
About maintaining that ignorance to protect your own privilege.
Exactly. And thinkers like Christy Dotson and Jose Medina, they've explored how mainstream epistemology often excludes knowledge that comes from marginalized groups. So it's not just about individuals being ignorant. It's about the systems of knowledge production themselves being biased.
So it's about who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, whose perspectives are valued, and whose are ignored.
Right. And Shannon Sullivan takes this even further, looking at the unconscious habits and the emotional dimensions of whiteness. She uses psychoanalysis and pragmatism to explore how racism is transmitted and enacted in these often subtle ways. Her concept of lived spatiality is really interesting here.
Okay, what's that about?
It's about how the historical sense of ownership and entitlement associated with whiteness still manifests today in things like gentrification and white nationalism. It's about how space itself is racialized.
So it's about who feels comfortable in certain spaces, who feels like they belong, and who feels like they're being pushed out.
Exactly. And it shows how even seemingly benign aspects of white culture, like the desire for colorblindness, can actually reinforce those patterns of inequality.
Right, because if you ignore the history of racism, if you ignore the ways that race still shapes our lives, then you're not really addressing the problem. You're just pretending it doesn't exist.
Exactly. Now, looking ahead, the source emphasizes the importance of these concepts like métissage, mestizaje,
Yeah.
and the creolization of cultures.
So the mixing of cultures and the creation of new hybrid forms.
Right. Despite all the efforts to create these rigid racial boundaries, human history has always been about mixing and exchange. And that's something to celebrate, to learn from.
And that leads to this idea of developing pluritopic frameworks for understanding the world.
Mhm.
So moving beyond these single dominant perspectives and recognizing the multiple standpoints that people come from.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the complexity of the world
Yeah.
and embracing that complexity. But the source also cautions that just the idea of mixing or hybridity isn't enough to guarantee equality. We saw that with Vasconcelos, whose vision of the cosmic race still had its own hierarchies.
So it's not just about mixing, it's about how that mixing happens and who benefits from it.
Right. And now we get to this really big debate within the study of race. What are the main causes of racism? Is it mostly about economics?
Hmm.
Like, is it driven by capitalism?
Mhm.
Or is it about culture and ideology?
This is a huge question.
Yeah. Traditional Marxist perspectives, they often downplay the role of race, focusing more on class conflict. But as the source points out, some anti-racist movements can also overlook the role of economics. So it's this complicated back and forth.
So how do we make sense of the relationship between race and class? Are they separate issues or are they intertwined?
Well, the source argues that racism is incredibly profitable. Historically, and even today, racial discrimination has been used to exploit workers, to justify colonialism and neocolonialism, and the concept of racial capitalism